All right, and we're back for another episode of Black Life Amplified. It is the virtual town hall series hosted by the African American Leadership Forum. My name is Brittany L. Wright, and before we get started, I want to give a very special thanks to our sponsors, which include the Minneapolis Foundation, Northpoint Health and Wellness, and Children's Minnesota for making this town hall possible. I also want to say thank you to our community partners who keep this town hall running, from organizations including Northpoint Health and Wellness, Children's Minnesota, Insight News, Gray Matter, the Minnesota Spokesman-Recorder, and Minnesota Community Care. Now, make sure you visit the African American Leadership Forum Facebook page as well as the YouTube channel to watch previous episodes of Black Life Amplified, and then make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe to stay up to date on all future episodes. Just last Friday, we did a special episode on how to keep your kids safe and engaged over the summer. So if you have young people, definitely check out that episode and visit those community resources. Now, for today's show, we're focused on the intersection of politics and activism within the Black community. There have been some recent events within our community that have inspired us to hold a public dialogue about how to push back against injustice without replicating the very systems and ideologies of white supremacy, patriarchy, ageism, ableism, homophobia, classism, and other biases that our communities have been subjected to, yet have resisted against since the beginning of time. So here to hold space for the nuance and the complexity of it all are our panelists. Please join me in welcoming Harry Colbert, who is the editor-in-chief at North News, Nick Muhammad, who is the executive director of the Black Civic Network, Reggie Edwards, who is the city manager for the City of Brooklyn Center, Mayor Mike Elliott, who is the mayor of Brooklyn Center, and of course, Adriene Thornton, who is a nurse and infection preventionist with Children's Minnesota. So welcome, panelists, to Black Life Amplified. Thank you so much for being here. Super excited to have you. Super excited to have you. So up first, I just want to talk about the intersection of politics and activism. And I want to really hear from all of you on how you identify the work that you do so that we can kind of get context as we move forward in the conversation of the framework, background, and perspective that you're bringing to this dialogue. And so I want to ask all of you if you identify as a politician, as an activist, or both, and what you do within your respective roles. So Harry, I will start with you.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I'm Harry Colbert Jr. I'm the editor-in-chief of North News, which is the newspaper and periodical in North Minneapolis. And before that, I was with Insight News for 10 years, 4 years as the managing editor. And I come to this conversation as with the lens of a Black person and the lens of a journalist who navigates both of those spaces. And understanding that I tell people often, reporting journalism is my profession, being Black is my life, and I come to the conversation always with that lens.
I love the way that you said that. And welcome back to the show. For those of you who don't know, Harry was the original host of this town hall when it went by a new name. So glad to have family back in the building. Speaking of family, my big brother is here, Nick Muhammad. Nick, I want to ask you, how do you see yourself, a politician, an activist, and how does that work as it relates to the work that you do at Black Civic Network?
Thank you for having us, Brittany. My take on it, first of all, I'm the executive director of Black Civic Network, but I've also, honed my activism at the intersection of art and political activism for, a little over 15 years actively. So for me in this particular space, I'm drawing from some of those experiences and dispositions when I evaluate, where we are today. But I come into the space particularly just as a Black man that's observing the country we live in and the times that we live in, and particularly being sympathetic to our youth and trying to understand their language and what their messages are, even if sometimes the tactics are extremely extreme. So that's how I'm coming into the space.
Thank you very much. Next, let's move to Adriene. Adriene, how do you come into this space?
Well, that's a loaded question. I come into this space wearing many hats. As the mother of a young Black male, as the mother of an aunt of several Black males, as a Southerner. I'm a Georgia peach. I was born and raised in Georgia, lived through Klan rallies. And so I bring all of the trauma associated with Black life and living through it in the South with me as well. But I'm a nurse. And so I'm a nurturer by nature. And I bring that to the space as well. And so my most recent hat is being an activist. I don't march in the streets. I've never been a marcher, even though I was born and raised in Georgia. I have typically been the quiet person in the background, supporting those people who are out front, making sure they have what they need to do what they do, whether it's health and wellness or food and well-being. But recently, I have found my own voice in all of the uprising and things that are happening in this country. And I have become sort of an activist, speaking for and with my allies in the suburbs, because I do live in the suburbs. And what I'm finding is that in the midst of all of this, they want to help and they don't know what to do. And they're looking for someone to speak to them, for them, and with them. And so I have found my voice in the last few years, and I'm using it in the way that I best know how, which is educating, informing, and speaking out with our allies in suburbia. So that is how I come into this space, as well as making sure that everyone is safe and doing whatever they do, making sure they're safe from COVID-19. So lots of hats, but making sure that, we're able to do what we need to do in this space.
Absolutely. And I would even say that the work of health equity is a form of activism in itself, making sure that we are treated well within the medical institutions that we are sometimes forced to come into contact with. Mayor Elliott, I want to go to you next. Obviously, you are the mayor of Brooklyn Center, but do you identify as a traditional politician? Do you see yourself as an activist or a hybrid?
Well, thanks for having me on, and it's an honor to be here with this illustrious panel that you have. So, I serve as mayor of Brooklyn Center, and this is an important question because I think how we see ourselves influences how we show up. I fundamentally see myself as a person serving in leadership at this level here, and I see myself as the biggest servant in my city. My role and how I see myself is to serve all of my community, protecting my community, all members of my community, and at the same time leading change and building a new future and a new reality where all members of our community are treated equally good and are similarly situated. And so I do see myself as a change maker, but leading change that is long overdue and is highly necessary. And one of the guiding principles for me is a quote I came across not too long ago where Mandela in, I believe it was 2005, at Make Poverty History talked about poverty. He said poverty is just like slavery and it's just like apartheid. And so I see myself as caring for somebody who is caring for the responsibility of working to affect change in a way that, for instance, will eradicate poverty and bring about transformative change.
Thank you for that. I love that you bring up Nelson Mandela. I actually studied truth and reconciliation in South Africa For me, I come into the space, I'm the host of this town hall, right? But the lens in which I'm asking these questions and why I felt like it was important for us to have this dialogue and for you all as panelists to be here has to do with our brilliant production team, of which I'm a part of. But for me, I come into the space as someone who has been on the activism side, the organizing side, as a creative as well as a journalist, and so I try to holistically say, how do we want to shape the narrative of our community, both the actions that we take as well as the systems of oppression that we have to come into contact with. And sometimes I do that through a journalism lens, and sometimes it's more through a creative lens. That's how I got to meet Nick, at the intersection of activism and hip hop. And in this particular conversation, I think it's so important for us to really unpack the ways in which we push back against these systems because of some recent events that have taken place within the Twin Cities. So as you all are aware, Vice Council Member Andrea Jenkins, about 2 weeks ago, was leaving a Pride celebration when, she was asked to be accountable to some of her actions, leading over the district where the George Floyd Square is. And there were some other demands that were made, and they were made under duress. She was held against her will for about 90 minutes by a group of protesters and was not allowed to leave, was forced to stay in her car with her partner, surrounded by a group of protesters until she agreed to sign their list of demands. Now, we come from people who have constantly had to protest and fight for even our basic liberties, right? And many would argue that we are still to this day not free. And we are also a product of the environments that we have been subjected into. And so I will also want to name that I want to hold compassion for all of the people who played a role in that incident, because we can only do the best that we can with what we have. And hopefully this can be a teaching moment so that we can figure out how to affect change in a way that doesn't further perpetuate harm or reenact the systems of oppression that we say that we're trying to dismantle, right? So that being said, I wanna unpack that moment and get your feedback. Harry, I'll start with you. When you heard about that incident, what was your reaction?
It was disheartening to hear about that incident, and my reaction was racism is so deep that we will fight among ourselves rather than address the people in whom our true anger, angst, and disappointment should be directed. At the end of the day, we ask people to step up into a leadership role. They say, if you want to change the system, we got to get our people in the system. Well, from what I've known through my years and interactions with Councilperson Jenkins, she has been a person who has been working as an activist through the system and outside of the system. So then when we get a person who has a position of authority, we expect them to move mountains in a day when the system was constructed over several hundred years. And that's just not how it works. At the end of the day, yes, every politician and community leader, including myself, needs to be held accountable for our deeds in this struggle. With that being said, holding someone accountable and holding someone virtually hostage are two totally separate ball games. And it was disheartening. I saw Councilperson Jenkins 2 days after the incident, and we hugged, and I talked and let her know that I support her as a person. At the end of the day, I don't have to agree with everything that she nor any of the other people in elected office do. But what I should do is at least offer them the respect for doing the work. And that's kind of where I fall on this.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to go to Nick Muhammad now. When you became aware of that incident, what was your reaction or response?
I actually had more questions than anything. You know, one of the things that always struck me when I hear people examine the past and how youth used to do things that were considered radical, whether it's, taking over a government building fully armed, or, even in St. Paul, there was fractions of people who literally let off explosives in downtown St. Paul in a department store out of frustration. And for me, what I've trained my mind to do is to look beyond the action and begin to look at the motivation. And for me, one of the things that I have to remain cognizant of as I get older and, grow into some of the power that I've built up over the years, I also have to remain very cognizant that I'm a different generation. So I place myself in situations where I'm keeping my ear to the youth and really seeing what's going on with them. And then I keep a hard eye on the baseline quality of life metrics that I'm trying to make sure is available for them. Desperation and things that happen to Councilmember Jenkins reflect people who don't see a future. They don't see change. They don't see hope. So they're living for the now. So they did something that was extreme, something that, in my opinion, wasn't very well thought out and wasn't the best strategy to go about it. But I'm not them. I'm not in their shoes. I don't know what they're wrestling with. I don't know these people's backgrounds. And for me, as a observer, I was proud of the fact that Councilmember Jenkins didn't, jump out the window and press charges on everybody. And at the same time, it is very disheartening to hear that, a city council person was treated in that fashion, particularly one that comes up out of our own Black community. And that's not something that we want to encourage amongst ourselves. But it also speaks to the fact that just because we get into these places and these spaces doesn't mean that, the fight's going to end or that the quality of life for everybody else that you're representing is improving, even though you're fighting and doing your best inside of a bureaucratic system. So just for me, just like I said, I had more questions than anything when I was made aware about it. Like, I still want to know what these individuals' agenda was, what they put on the table, how thought out was it? Like, who are we talking about? Who are we dealing with? What are their backgrounds? Are they from here? Just what their rationale was. Because at the end of the day, if we don't understand them, it could grow like wildfire. But if we take the time to actually listen to them and hear what they have to say, we'll be able to nip this thing in the bud and actually act as good community leaders and making sure that we're in tune with the people that we say we're leading.
Very well said. Thank you. I want to go to Mayor Elliott now and give you a chance to react.
All right. Well, thanks. I have compassion for Councilwoman Jenkins, and also for the folks that are really fighting for their freedom and that are fighting against a system that they view as oppressive, and a system that has taken the lives of. If you look at the young man that was involved in that situation, he's just about the age of many of the people whose lives have been taken by police. I've seen him speak at the Capitol and in other settings. I've seen him very emotionally talk about the plight that he and his community are experiencing. I believe he's probably right around the age of Winston Smith as well, and so the pain and anguish that he and others have experienced, I think, is what probably is leading them to take the actions that they see as necessary action. I started this by quoting Nelson Mandela, and this is another instance where I'll quote Mr. Mandela. If you recall, during the apartheid movement, there were many different tactics that were used. And he said this in response to questions around the fact that they were, using measures that were considered extreme, including taking up arms or bombing buildings. Obviously, no one's calling for that at all. And I'm not comparing, the actions of these young people to that level of extreme action. But what he said in response was, a freedom fighter learns the hard way that it is the oppressor who defines the nature of the struggle, and the oppressed is often left no recourse but to use methods that mirror those of the oppressor. At a point, one can only fight fire with fire. All this to say that, at a certain point, when these young people have seen the state legislature come up short time and time again, refuse to take meaningful action that's going to stop the killing of people who look just like them, people who are about their age, it drives them to more and more measures that we might consider extreme. And so the real solution then is to simply pass the laws that are going to protect their lives.
Absolutely. I want to go to Adriene next. When you were made aware of this incident, what was your initial reaction?
Well, my initial reaction was, as a woman and being a Black woman, is why are we always the target of everyone's anger? Why do we have to shoulder the burden of everyone's unhappiness? Whenever people get angry and they want results, they tend to come after us. We're the least protected of all the people in this world. And it doesn't matter where you are. Women, and especially Black women, are just the least protected and the first targeted. So that was my initial response. And then when I put on my mother/nurse hat and the nurturing side of me came out, I started questioning things. Where did we, and when I say we, I mean we as a community, where did we fail? Because clearly we have failed in something that we did or didn't do for this young man and his friends and followers to feel like that was what needed to happen at that moment. Are we not educating them on the legislative process? Do they not truly understand how much power and influence Representative Jenkins has? Clearly, they thought that she could do more than she's able to do. Do they understand? Have we educated them on what the responsibilities of the council members are? Are we doing our part to make sure that they understand that if they want to change, they're going to have to be part of that change in terms of running for office and becoming police officers in their own neighborhoods? And so, after the grief and the sadness and the disappointment and the events that were happening, and feeling like it was a personal attack on me as a Black woman because I share her pain and her anguish, then it's, well, what have we done wrong and what can we do to fix this and make it better so that things like this don't happen again? I totally understand, the frustration and feeling like nobody's hearing you, nobody sees you, and nobody's doing anything. But we all know that there are things being done, perhaps not as quickly as we would like it to, and not in the ways that we want it to, but things are being done. So what do we need to do as a community to uplift our young people and make sure that they understand the processes that are occurring, but also make sure they understand what their part is in making this change happen? We can't continue to vote in people who don't have our best interests at heart and expect things to be different. So it was kind of a mix of grief, disappointment, sadness, and then awareness that we as a community have a lot more work to do to make sure that we support, uplift, engage our youth and our young people in the political process.
You know, Adrienne, you led with the concept of being a Black woman and in the lack of protection, being in these bodies that we often feel. And that was actually going to be my follow-up question to you is, you know, when I saw the video and I was made aware of the incident, all I could think about is how exhausting it is to be a Black woman who shows up to work, is mistreated, and then is still expected to act in a particular manner. Otherwise, you'll be labeled as, you know, an angry Black woman or some other negative trope in an effort to further disassociate you from a community that historically Councilmember Jenkins has showed up and served with a whole lot of integrity, right? And I don't think that this is unique to politics. This is the reality that Black women experience. And then you take into consideration the additional biases that Councilmember Jenkins has to navigate as a Black trans woman, as an elder. There are so many different barriers that she's facing, and it really makes me think about how we can do better to hold one another accountable, while also being better allies to the Black women in our workspaces, and what it's going to take. What I saw in this instance is people actually did speak up and speak out publicly and say, you know, we think what happened actually went too far. This was actually not appropriate, but that's for a local elected official. Had she been serving in a regular organization, would people have felt as compelled to stick up for her? You know, and for me personally, that's not something that I feel or experience in terms of being protected by the people within my community, you know, and that's not from people who I may have perpetuated harm against. That's even people who I am in community and actively building with. I feel that lack of protection, and I think that's important to name within this conversation. I want to go to Nick and ask, is there actually a right or wrong way to hold people accountable, though? You know, I hear you and others saying, okay, well, they took it too far. And also what I know is direct actions work, organizing works, activism works, you know, and that's not just what we've seen in recent times. You know, Malcolm X says by any means necessary. So when does by any means necessary take it too far? Because what this situation somewhat reminded me of was the Morrill Hall takeover. You know, I am a product of the Morrill Hall takeover. My degree, my second degree is in African and African American studies, which wouldn't have existed if 70 students didn't occupy Morrill Hall, where the president of the University of Minnesota sat, right? So we know occupying a space and not holding a leader hostage, but occupying a space and having a list of demands can be effective. Why in this case do you feel like it was too far? And how do we discern then what's the appropriate way to hold our leaders within our community accountable?
So I'll approach it from two different angles. First, you know, to the point of the protection of Black women, the question that always bugs me is who's raising the protectors? Where are they being trained? Where are they being groomed? Where are they being taught that responsibility coming up? Right. And the reality of that is that we haven't took a long look in the mirror of our community and actually assessed how healthy is the community. Stable societies are able to provide, you know, reliable predictors of the future and based on the past and the present, and it informs how we look at things. So if we were able to, if these young people were looking at the past and looking at where they were right now, what were they actually learning about the future as far as possibility, right? The confidence in that future grows when we invest to make sure that that future is predictable as a community. When we don't invest to make sure that the future is predictable to the youth are going to do one or two things. They're either going to, lay down and roll with the punches and, do whatever's been done, or they're going to rebel. I steer a little clear of trying to define what was necessary, right? Because I'm not in their shoes. I haven't even had a conversation with these young people. So to sanction or condemn what they did, the reality is we're sitting here talking now because they took action, good, bad, or indifferent. And one of the things that I strive to make sure that I don't do is get comfortable in what I understand and what I achieved and how I achieved it. The reality is, if what I achieved actually made the impact that it was supposed to, it's supposed to be reflected in our youth's commitment and confidence in the structures that we're saying are the pathway to stability. And the reality of the matter is, I've been involved in the activist, political, and organizing scene for 20 years. But when I look at the quality of life and the socioeconomic status of Black people in the state, it hasn't moved one iota, and it's actually gotten worse. Now, that does not mean that we can't find people who are successful. That doesn't mean we can't find families that are doing great for themselves and their children. We're talking about the rule, not the exception. And the reality of the matter is, as we continue to move forward, especially coming out of COVID, there were so many people that were brought to the reality that the Black community is simply not okay. And if we're honest about the fact that we're not okay as a community, that means we have to be honest about the fact that there's certain social contracts, as in, the protection of women and children and men, that is not enforceable because the people are not even healthy. That's just a fact of where we are. And to expect that from a group that we all collectively say in one hand is, the most disparity riddled community in the state, and this state is ranked, top 5 in the worst of conditions for us in the country. But then on the other hand, we're saying we're going to tap into a resilience that back in the day was supported by a community that was strong enough to support these youth. When they went to jail, it was the elders, the grandparents, the mothers, and the fathers who went and got these kids out of jail. And in some cases, they went against the wishes of their parents, but their parents were still there. The community was still there. They still had communities to go back to once they were done making their statement. And we were able to wrap around them and still encourage them to pursue, higher education, entrepreneurship, and their families, and whatever personal development they wanted to do with an actual community. Where we sit now, we sit in places where we don't even own our homes half the time. Half of those youth I would bank don't even have their own place to live. They're probably couch hopping. So I'm very cautious about how I look at them and assume that they have all the stability to remain sane if their quality of life is such that they thought it was a good idea to literally detain a sitting council member. And that was the best idea. To me, that means that the environment and the community that we claim is out here serving them is not as strong as we think it is.
Very well said. As young leaders, I think it's important for us, as now older leaders. I think I'm crossing over. I'm not quite a youth anymore. I think we have to hold ourselves. I'm 30, so I don't think anyone is looking at me as a youth. I'm young, but we have to hold ourselves accountable to the generations that come after us to say any manner in which they behave is a reflection of us. And I think it's so easy for leaders of different generations to point the finger and say that you all should have behaved in this manner and you're doing things a different way. I think different is okay. I think different is good. It's innovative, right? And also, Councilmember Jenkins is an elder, right? And I think there is a level of, us needing to do a better job as a community of allowing the innovation of our young leaders to flourish, and also there's a way in which I think we need to really be cognizant of how we hold our elders accountable. There are tensions in our community right now that many of you, I'm sure, are aware of, that show an indication of a generational divide. This is just one of many, right? But not all of our elders are doing right by our community. And we have to also be honest about that. While we honor them and we recognize the contributions that they've put forth, especially through their years of service within community, what do we then do when a pillar of our community who we have trusted has perpetuated harm, or there is the feeling of harm? You know, going back to the point about the wellness of the community and mental health, one of the demands that was made by the activists was to just leave George Floyd Square alone. People just wanted a space to grieve and to celebrate and to hold Black joy. Now, you know, the nuance of that is there have been a lot of residents in that district and business owners that say, open it up because, you know, we're struggling here. This is a national tourist site now that we didn't necessarily sign up for when we signed our mortgages, right? And people are saying, we can't unsee what happened to George Floyd. So we can't go back to business as usual. And to expect us to, without the proper resources or even just some notice, you know, people woke up one day and got messages saying, hey, there's a group out here tearing down George Floyd Square. Now, if that's your safe place and that's your place to grieve, that's traumatic. If that's the place that you've gone to for the past year to hold space for the fact that people who look like you suffer from the hands of people who are supposed to protect and serve, you might act in a way that you normally wouldn't. Or you might be so tired of constantly being told that your life doesn't matter and shown that your life doesn't matter in the myriad of ways that Black people experience that you decide there are no more rules. And so I think we're at a really unique place in history where we're changing laws. More people who look like us are running for office. But I don't think we've got enough practice in holding those people who look like us accountable when they get into the system, right? You know, if it was an everyday person off the street, it might just be, okay, well, now we just got to fight. You know, if it was within your organization, all right, well, we're going to hold a meeting and we're going to, you know, do Robert's Rules of Orders and, you know, go through some parliamentary procedure to get through it. But what happens when one of us crosses over into that political sphere? So I want to go to you, Mayor Elliott. You are a mayor, so it's a little bit different than being within the city council, but you're an elected official nonetheless, and you happen to be a member of the Black community, right? If you were in this position where you made an unpopular opinion, you made an action using your position of power to do something that people felt harmed by, how could your constituents hold you accountable in a way in which you would be actively listening and willing to possibly make a different decision?
Well, you know, this is a very important question. The sensitivity around George Floyd Square, I think, is in some ways parallel with the sensitivity around where Daunte Wright was killed, and also the site in front of the police department where these same young people were protesting the killing of Daunte Wright. What we have decided to do, so I can answer your question by maybe giving a real example. So the family of Daunte Wright called me in great distress because they had worked with an artist and community activists, and they were spelling the words Daunte Wright on the fence in front of the police department. And they were going to have a march from the site where Daunte was killed to the police station the following day. And I got this call that there were police out there ripping down Daunte Wright off of the fence in front of the police station. And I knew the right thing to do was to allow for the family to have that. And they were specifically putting this up so his mother could see his name when they got to the site at the end of the march. And so we made the decision to leave Dante Wright's name on the fence, spelled out in air fresheners. And that decision, I think, was very helpful in helping the community heal. In fact, the Dante Wright's name is still on that fence. And we're, in fact, going to preserve that at some point. We're also actively working with the family and with our community members to determine how to properly memorialize the site where Dante Wright was killed. And that's collaborative work with the family, with members of our community, with the neighbors. And we're doing that work together. I think that is the right approach.
Thank you for sharing that. I definitely wanted to touch on Dante Wright. Was there anything else in regards to the case or just how the City of Brooklyn Center will be handling things moving forward that you wanted to share?
Well, the case is in the hands of the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, at this point. And I think the trial is going to be, it's scheduled for December, to begin in December, where that's all the information we have at this point. But we're, like everybody else, just watching and seeing, waiting to see. We want to make sure that justice is served in this case. Of course, true justice is Dante Wright being here still for his family, his mother and father, for his brothers and sisters, and for his child. And we're also, in the name of Dante, moving forward with some real reforms. Our community, spoke up in the midst of all of this. They demanded change. Many of those young people that were out there with the councilwoman were in my chambers, and they were demanding change. They were at our listening sessions, and as a result, we've decided to move in the direction of listening to the community and implementing real change. So, we're shifting. We're looking at what kind of calls we get in to 911. Over 80% of those calls are for non-crime, non-criminal related type of calls where you don't need somebody with a gun to show up. So we're looking at that. We're studying what the patterns are, what type of services people are calling for, and what's the proper response to keep our community safe. Our community said enough is enough. It's time for change, and that's what we're doing. So we're creating this new structure, redefining what public safety is. A lot of people equate public safety with police, and that's not the same thing. Police happen to be part of public safety, but how do we truly keep our community safe? Right now, we spend 43% of our general fund dollars on police. 43%, that's near 50%. All right, Edina spends 14% of its budget on policing. So what could we do to keep our community safe and improve the public safety? We can improve and spend money on housing, on childcare, make sure everybody in the city has access to childcare, make sure we have summer and after school activities, make sure that there's kids in our community have things that are going to help them improve their skills to be able to go to the best universities and have access to the best jobs that are available. Make sure that we're increasing down payment housing assistance, educating people on how to get access to all those resources as well. In public safety, we're saying, look, we can have our fire department, our police department, but they got to be underneath this other department that's our community safety and violence prevention, that's headed by somebody who's got a background in public health. And then we got to have a community response department where we work with the community to say, all right, who should go if your neighbor calls and says you're playing music too loud? Should it be somebody with a gun or should it be somebody else? Who should go if there's a mental health crisis? Should it be somebody with a gun or somebody else? We think in both of those instances it's somebody else. And then we're doing civilian traffic enforcement. We're looking at how we can remove somebody with a gun pulling people over for tabs and expired tabs and air fresheners and the likes. And then we're implementing a citywide citation and summons policy. What this means is that in order for somebody to be arrested, it cannot be for low-level offenses. It cannot be for traffic infractions. It cannot be for non-felony offenses and non-felony warrants. And if you can't even search people also. So if you're going to do any of those things, search or arrest people, and you bring them back, detain them, you've got to write a lengthy report telling us why you did that. We're going to track that information, and then we're going to make it public. So we're also increasing accountability. We've got a task force that's going to be an oversight task force for the police and for the overall community safety and violence prevention, made up of community members. And they're also going to propose policies that are going to be able to help us improve our public safety. So we're taking all of these steps to make sure that we're improving public safety. And the final thing I'll say is that in '68, the Kerner Commission report headed by the then Illinois governor, the Kerner Commission was commissioned by President Johnson to study the so-called riots of the '60s. And they found that the people there they saw themselves as being part of a rebellion against the economic conditions that they were facing, the systematic shutting out from the federal housing mortgage programs and all of the state and federal economic programs, the fact that they weren't being rented to. Only folks in the Jewish community, for instance, in Michigan would rent to them. I talked to an elder who lived through that time who said he was out there and he was running out the store with cereal. Highly respected member of our community. But he said they were out there protesting because the police killed somebody, but they were protesting the deep economic inequities that was in the back of all of that. So we're also taking a look at that. How is it that we can bring up to par where groups of people are not suffering these deep disparities in home ownership rates and in access to childcare and in income levels? What can we do? And how can we commit ourselves, and we are committing ourselves to making sure that there is parity in those areas? Because if we do that, we know that we're going to improve the public safety.
So all of those initiatives sound incredibly important, and I want to commend you and the other leaders at the City of Brooklyn Center for really being thoughtful about how we move forward and reimagine public safety, especially within this moment. But I want to go back to the original question about accountability. You mentioned getting a phone call from the right family, but what if, an everyday person, the right family, they have a little bit of an elevated profile now because of what happened to Dante, right? If a young person who doesn't have an elevated profile, who may not have access to your phone number, but who wants their voice to be heard, who is concerned about something that's happening within the city, who may not have the capacity or the skill set to sit on the committees that you've mentioned, how do they go about then asking questions, getting the training so that they can be effective at the with having a seat at the table and holding you or other leaders accountable? Is there a system in place? Do you give out your phone number, your email? Is there an assistant that they can reach out to? Like on the most surface level, how can community members work with you so that they don't feel like they have to work against you?
Certainly. So I do have an email that I can share, and that is Mayor Elliott with 2 L's and 2 T's at ci.brooklyn-center.mn.us. It's a long email, and you can Google it and it'll come up as well if you need to get in touch with me. And then my phone number is also available on our city website. You can call my office direct line, and I'll give you a call back. Any young person out there can always request to have a meeting with me. I'm available, or at least if I'm not available, I'll have a staff member have that meeting, and I'll follow up to find out what the concerns are. I think we have to be open to understanding what the deep concerns are in our community from young people, because they are the vanguards of change in every generation. It's always been the young people that have led us to a better world. So definitely reach out if you have any questions. I think that this other part of your question, though, that you asked is important. You said, how do we make sure that young people have the training? One thing I want to point out is that Nexus Community Partners has a training program specifically for Black folk who are interested in serving on these boards and commissions, or interested, in getting involved in decision-making bodies. And they have this program that's available for you to go and take this course that will teach you, how to participate in those settings and make your voice heard. But however you find that, it is important, however you find, whatever means you find to communicate, I think it's important that you find strength and confidence to communicate to the fullest extent what you believe, because that's the only way that we can, truly bring about change. And I'm open to being accountable, in so many different ways. People write me, they call me, they stop me in the store and or at the restaurant. Like I started this talking about the fact that I view myself as the biggest servant in my city, and I'm truly here to serve the community.
Thank you for that, and thank you to our producers who put the mayor's email at the bottom of the screen. I want to go to Harry now and talk about what accountability looks like and how we teach that. So when you are a leader in community in any capacity, right, and you perpetuate harm, what do you think is the appropriate action to take to rectify that?
I don't know that there's a right or a wrong way to answer that question, but I want to step back for just a second. And Nurse Adriene Thornton mentioned it earlier about the level of protection that we have for Black women. And I think back to what happened with Councilwoman Jenkins, and it concerns me that individuals felt they had that power over someone, whereas had Councilwoman Jenkins been someone else, I'm hypothesizing, but I don't think that they might have felt that they had that type of power to restrain someone in that manner. When we're talking about accountability, the bottom line is we have to hold one another accountable. But what I observe is sometimes I find ourselves always holding us to a greater standard than we hold those who have perpetuated the greatest harm against us. And it comes off as and the throwback line is, well, we expect them to do it. We don't expect you to do it. We shouldn't expect anybody to do it, bottom line. And so that's where I have an issue with yes, absolutely hold each and every one of us accountable. And we need to have our feet held to the fire, but don't do it at the peril of, or not necessarily the peril, but don't do it where you wouldn't feel comfortable doing it to a white person in a similar or same position. When we talk about this community violence, a lot of the community violence is there's unfortunately a level of familiarity where we can perpetrate this violence amongst self, and for the same kind of atrocity that was perpetuated, that you said your brother or sister perpetuated against you, if a white person does it, we're not having that same level of reaction. And that's where I have an issue. Is we are so traumatized by racism in this country that we are quicker to fight and disparage one another than we are to understand the true perpetrator of all of this community trauma that we have. And I'm telling you right now, it ain't us.
You know, you bring up a really good point about the way in which our community has sometimes gone about seeking justice or accountability when there's a member of within our community who has perpetuated harm. And, you know, I think we again have to shed a light on the ways in which we choose to respond to things or to react to things, and to recognize that oftentimes our people are replicating what they see and what they know. And what we see and what we know inherently, subversively, and with sometimes unconsciously is white supremacy. And so we replicate that, thinking, you know, that we are moving forward in a radical way, and oftentimes what we're really doing is replicating. I think about the Audre Lorde quote about how the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, right? And so it comes down to education and us learning how to deal with one another. You know, conflict is inevitable, right? There will be times in which all of us are guilty of perpetuating harm against one another, but we need to be in better practice and to do the work actively and consistently to hold one another accountable, to be able to step back and say, you know, please pardon me for whatever reason in which I chose to make this decision or behave in this particular way. I apologize. Please let me rectify whatever harm has been done. And let's come up with a process to reconcile and to further make sure that accountability is had. Now, these conversations are happening in pockets of communities. I'm seeing them. And also I'm noticing a greater lean towards the very loud, brash, conflict-driven direct action method. I think I don't know if it's the moment that we're in because we've had so many cases of police brutality that people have to take to the streets, or if it's simply people don't know how else to move forward, or if that's just who we are. You know, I was talking to a leader in community who's doing some really phenomenal organizing right now, and part of her methodology was a little more aggressive than how I may have handled the situation. And when I asked her why she chose to respond in that way instead of just kind of being grounded and lovingly holding a conversation with this community leader who she felt like perpetuated harm against her, her response was, you know, at the end of the day, I really love hip hop, and I love a battle. It's a part of us. That is how I choose to go about conflict, which was a really interesting perspective. So I want to go to you, Nick, as a hip hop artist and someone who's been in the hip hop activism intersection, and also because I see you're laughing right now. Is that just how we deal with one another because it's a part of our culture, or have we not learned that there is more to us in times of conflict than a more aggressive approach?
So it's a little bit of both, if we're being honest about the situation. You know, the thing that strikes me is when we talk about how the system of accountability works amongst ourselves, we're failing to remember that it's not just a matter of accountability, right? These are talking points that are often used, particularly when describing Black male activity in particular. So, you know, the first thing everybody loves to say is that Black men need to be accountable. Black men are so accountable that, you know, we're the main ones killing ourselves, right? And that's what you're looking at. You're looking at accountability in its extreme, absent of consciousness, right? And because they can't go after or don't know how to properly go after the people who are responsible for, in a lot of cases, dysfunction, mental health breakdowns, and depression, we keep glazing over the fact that a lot of these people are just not healthy. The community as a whole is not healthy. This is not just as simple as saying that we're going to be, self-reflective and hold ourselves accountable from our positions of fortitude and fluency. We're talking about the youth who literally are watching us. They're not stupid. They're watching us and saying 1 + 1 = 2. They're looking at the fact that George Floyd just happened, and we've had several other Black male bodies after George Floyd with George Floyd's lawn signs all over these so-called progressive learning and empathetic communities. That's the reality. Now, we'd like to romanticize the fact that, because we've made certain inroads into the halls of power and different corridors that we can negotiate different things, we understand that there's a level of patience, perseverance, strategy, camaraderie that's going to be required in order for us to get things accomplished. But what we're saying to our youth is wait on us to get it done. And they're saying, as they're reading the historical accounts, this particular generation has more information at their fingertips than we have ever had in our youth. And one of the byproducts of that is they're outpacing us in their logic models of how to get things done, good, bad, or indifferent. So one of the reasons that I'm taking this approach is because as we look at, again, what happened after George Floyd. Now, to the mayor's point, I like the fact that he was, naming certain practical things that he's trying to get done, but we got to make sure that we're opening up opportunities for thought leadership directly from the community that is not always going to be contingent upon keeping white people comfortable, right? And if we started with ourselves, like we always do, everything starts within our own respective families and communities and our personal circles first. That's why that happened to Councilmember Jenkins in the fashion it does. Other council members probably wouldn't have even been in the circle or even allowed in the proximity of the circle in the same way. They don't feel that affinity, right? And this is not condoning what they did, but I'm saying that's why it happened that way. It's just like asking why gangbangers don't shoot police officers as opposed to shooting themselves. We know the answer to that is self-hatred. But somehow we're expecting people who are exhibiting self-hatred to all of a sudden develop a moral compass to guide their recklessness. To me, we're insane for expecting that. Instead, we have to create inroads that actually help them expand their realm of understanding. And again, I still commend Councilmember Jenkins for not going the traditional route and dragging police officers into the midst of what was going on. And I think we're missing the opportunity to actually create a bridge with these particular activists and youth and helping them understand the misstep as well as ways that they can actually get what they want done. And they have to be educated on the context and the power and the capacity of power that our elected officials have that might look like us. And that's something that we always kind of glaze over. Our youth are a reflection of what we invest in them. Period. So if we don't like what we see, it's just like, speaking of hip hop, there was a moment when our elders were running over hip hop albums for news stories. They said that the culture wouldn't last 8 years and it was a bunch of mumbo jumbo. Well, the youth felt different. Here we are 40 years later, and it's one of the most powerful genres and cultures in the world that have united more people in some cases than even governments and religions. But the youth were the ones that fought to create it and fought for it to have a birth and fought for it to take up space. The elders understood later. And sometimes we're in that moment. And as I'm crossing 43, I don't dare call myself a youth by any stretch of the imagination. I have children who are in those age brackets who feel the exact same way. And when I'm tapping in with them or some of the youth in the neighborhoods that I still live in, and I'm trying to figure out what they're thinking, their realm of thought is just much different than ours. And as much as I'd like my wisdom in the ways that I've learned and the elders that, were kind enough to guide me to influence them, that's on me to create that generational connection, because I'm the one that's there. And that's not laying anything at the feet of Councilmember Jenkins. It's just saying that we're not, I think that we romanticize the unintelligence of our youth to a state where we are the ones with all the answers, instead of actually hearing them out and saying, hey, we need to do some critical intervention earlier, so that this isn't the idea that spreads with other youth, that it's something that happened. And then we're sitting here saying they wouldn't do it to somebody else. And just to prove us wrong, they go and do it to somebody else from a white ethnic background and end up all over the news, shot up and killed because they weren't having it. Instead of daring them to go do it, because I think they have the gall to go do it. I don't want to set that precedence. What I want to say is, like, look, there's a long-term vision and a short-term vision. You don't have to kidnap your council member in order to get their attention. There's a way to do this. Let us help you facilitate that. That's the approach that I think is going to work better. There's a lack of connection because there's a lack of dialogue and too much assumption.
Very well said. Harry, I want to go to you next.
Okay. You had mentioned the kind of culture of hip hop and the battle. When we talked about true hip hop battles, the person who was generally considered the victor was the one who was a wordsmith, someone who can articulate their point and resonate with the people. We need to again start battling with intelligence, and not saying that we haven't been, but we need to make sure that that is the forefront of the battle. Battling with our words with intelligence, and letting that lead the conversation. Let's also understand this: when we're talking about accountability, we don't have some of the positive actions that came out of this horrific killing of Dante Wright if we don't have a mayor who looks like us in position. We don't have George Floyd being probably even we don't have Derek Chauvin probably even being charged, if not for an attorney general in Keith Ellison being there. And let's also understand that that was the closest election of the night, going back to when he ran for attorney general. We almost had a Trump supporting far right conservative as our attorney general, if not for the vote of many in the community. So we ask for people. We ask for people to be in these positions. We have to support them and not tear them down once they get there. Absolutely hold them accountable. But when we go back to like Ferguson, for example, you had a young brother who I knew as Oops, who was a battle rapper, who got so fed up with what was happening that he later transformed to become what more of the world knows as Bruce Franks Jr., state representative in Missouri. We've got to be able to put ourselves in these positions and direct change in that manner. And once we get there, we can't immediately start to try to tear one another down just because they're quote unquote part of the system.
No, you're absolutely right. This is actually a conversation that we had on our town hall a couple of weeks ago. If you go to the episode that's entitled Black Leadership Amplified, we talk about how we often fight for a seat at the table. And then once members of our community advance and they get those seats at the table, I think sometimes those who remain at a grassroots level may get the illusion or start to feel so disconnected because they may not see them on the ground in the same way, that they feel like, oh, well, that person no longer represents us, as if they don't still carry the same burden of being a Black person, right? And so that is a really important concept to keep in mind. Yesterday, I spent some time speaking to a group of young people with a passion for media. And Harry, I know that's part of the work that you do in training up the next generation of leaders. What do you want to pass on, or what is the work that you're doing in hopes that our leaders, one, just feel connected to you as a community leader, and so that trust is built?
one of the things that we want to do is, and I teach over at North Community High School journalism. One of the main things, we're teaching them how to write a proper news story, but I think what's most important is we are teaching critical thinking skills. At the end of the day, what makes a journalist or any person truly successful is their ability to critically think throughout all situations and have a proper understanding of the subject matter in which they are in it, articulating, or proper understanding of what field they are in. And so I think that that's what I want to get across most, is that we have to have these critical, analytical thinking youth who move with not devoid of emotion, but where emotion doesn't be their sole guide in their decision making. Because these young individuals who were encountering Councilwoman Jenkins, unfortunately, the decisions that they made were guided, I believe, more by emotion than they were by an analytical thought process, where more of a dialogue could have been held.
And speaking of journalists, I do just want to mention that we did reach out to Councilmember Jenkins as well as DJ Hooker, who was one of the lead activists in that occupation, for them to comment on this matter. And I don't believe that we got responses from either one. And I just want to wrap this conversation up in the interest of time. I want to go to you, Mayor Elliott. What are you doing, or what do you hope to do to build trust as an elected official? So for those who may not have known you until this moment when Daunte Wright was killed, you're showing us and you're telling us that you're doing things to try and be thoughtful about the way in which you occupy your position and that you show up and serve. But there's a healthy distrust of elected officials, especially within our community. Even in preparation of this conversation, I went and looked up what is the definition of an activist versus the definition of a politician. The definition of a politician was this: number one, a person who was professionally involved in politics, especially as a holder or a candidate for an elected office. Second definition says a person who acts in a manipulative and devious way, typically to gain advancement within an organization. Like that's the first thing that pops up in Google when you ask for a definition for a politician. And so what do you hope to do, or what is your plan for building trust so that people know you're different than what our communities have historically known from someone who occupies your seat?
Well, I think the most important thing is that, we're being transparent and authentic. What I can say is that when Daunte Wright was killed and all the news cameras showed up, at our doors, I had nothing to go on really except for values that I was raised with, and what I saw as the truth. And so that's basically what I led with. But in terms of building trust, I think people can or should really only trust what they see and what they what the outcomes are from our actions. I don't believe so much in rhetoric. I think it is important to communicate clearly what as a leader, what you believe and what direction you're heading in. But more than anything else, I believe in outcomes. So I say, in order as leaders for us to build trust with the community, we need to show results. The proof is in the pudding. And as we do that, as we focus on that, people will have no option but to trust us, that we're going to actually be working for them. And, so that's how I see it. And the work that we're doing, I mentioned we're going to be collecting data. We're going to be making that publicly available. One of the other things what we're going to do is put a dashboard on our city website that shows how well we're doing in all these different areas, whether it's how many kids have access to a good education or programs, or how many people have access to our home down payment assistance programs, or who's being pulled over and stopped, and what are they being pulled over and stopped for in our city. Are they Black? Are they Latino? Are they Hmong? Are they Asian? Are they, what's their background? How often they're being stopped. So we're really building in transparency in what we're doing, and we're super focused on results. I think that's the key.
Thank you. And thank you again for being here, Mayor Elliott. Nick, I want to go to you before we close out this conversation and go to our COVID updates. As the executive director of the Black Civic Network, as someone who has, done grassroots community activism and organizing within the community, been within the hip hop community, you now hold this unique position where you are mobilizing power within the community to build a political and economic base within the Black community. Your work is rooted in and grounded in encouraging people who look like us to cast their vote and let it be heard, and to affect change, and to hold those in positions of power to have policies in place that work in our best interest, right? So I will ask you a similar question to what I asked Mayor Elliott, and for our community who is just skeptical of this system in general. You have been at that intersection of activism and politics, and you're doing a really phenomenal work to make sure that we're building power in ways that are sustainable. But in order for people to want to get engaged, there has to be a faith that this type of work is working. So what do you have to say to our community members who feel, as if there is no direction, no guidance, or it's just not effective?
The first thing I would tell them is to join a Black organization that represents your interests. And I know there's a lot of pushback about institutions, young, ambitious, energetic, new, emerging leaders to actually take their rightful place inside of those organizations and take up space. Don't go by yourself. Take a group of you. Hit that organization with 30 of y'all and just run in and bum rush the agenda. And I know all the organizations that are out there, they have a lot of crossing over youth leadership that is now becoming into their elder status. But the reality is you just have to get involved. And one of the things that we learned, when we started 4 years ago, we began to raise the conversation around reparations. And the second we started talking about that, we had a bunch of people laughing at us saying, this was pie in the sky. You're tripping. You're going too far. It's too ambitious. And here we are just 4 years later, and there's a council for it in St. Paul. We have a bill, authored by Senator Champion being developed. There's a national conversation around it. And the reality is everybody's realizing that that's one of the things that has to happen in order for us to survive things like COVID. And what COVID exposed is that those disparities that were caused by centuries of injustices to the Black community put us in a position where we were disproportionately impacted due to our status and that injustice never being addressed. Now, I'll say in regards to the youth and feeling hopeful, part of your confidence and your hope in the future is going to come from your competence. One of the things that I want to encourage them to do is, one, just admit when you don't understand a process. Those processes are usually housed in institutions that are publicly funded, which means you have a right to go in there and ask as many questions until you feel like you have adequate answers. These people work for you. Every elected official works for you. So don't assume that they have this power and then you're down here. No, you're the taxpayer. You're the future. They work for you. Go in there with that disposition. And most elected officials that are in tune and smart, they understand that that's really the case. You're their constituency. You're who they claim to represent, but you also have to be clear and articulate in what you want. Make sure that you know what your demand is. Make sure that you take the time to write that out. Make sure you take the time to read up on what a mayor is, what a strong mayor system, weak mayor system, city council. Figure out what their capacity for power is. The same way you all consume, whatever the latest hip hop video is, and y'all can spew it out and get the latest TikTok dance down. Go and educate yourself on the capacity of power, and then figuring out exactly who is going to do what and who's responsible for whatever ill you're trying to target. And the other thing is, make sure that you understand that laws come from the people. Okay, you can come up with a law. You can go down to the state capitol with an idea and find your local legislator and tell them, hey, I need you to author a bill around this particular issue. Or you can go down to the city council and say, I want an ordinance around XYZ. You have that power. It's not something you have to wait for. It's not something you have to ask permission for. And if you all are able to organize in the numbers that you all are organizing in, remember that those numbers equal votes to these elected officials. And if you all come with an actual organized demand around your vote in that area, I guarantee they'll make time, clear out their schedule, because the second you get over a couple hundred people that live in one elected official's district, they're going to make time to make sure that they actually listen to you, because elections are won and lost every day on a couple hundred votes, a few, tens of votes, and maybe even 1,000 votes. But you all are making up a constituency that is garnering attention. And the last thing I'll say in the lines of doing things differently. Personally, I've been on the outside of the processes of internal political administrative work, in my earlier years. In my later years, I find myself inside of a lot of these spaces. And we have to be honest about the fact that these spaces are hostile to Black thought leadership. And I'm going to say that again. They're hostile to Black thought leadership, meaning we're coming in with the experience of everything that's currently structured and telling them, hey, this isn't working for us. Here are the things that we need to have happen. And the propensity for them to default to what they think is supposed to work for you is what you have the right to go in there and interrupt. So case in point, we got involved with the POST board, the Police Officer Service Training Regulatory Board. This is the board that is in charge of police officers licensing. Do you know it was 2021 before we actually had a rule put on the table proposed to say that an officer cannot be affiliated with a white nationalist or supremacist group? This board has been completely inactive, and we need the public to understand that. And if you have gone through an interaction with the police officers that you think is conduct unbecoming of an officer, and you have an idea of something that should be put in the context of their licensing, something that needs to be addressed, email us. Let us know. We sit on the community advisory board for the POST board. If you have an experience with police officers and no one's listening to you, make your voice heard at that POST board and say they need a rule around XYZ, otherwise they lose their license. You have the capacity to do that. I'm opening that particular aspect up because at the end of the day, we have not allowed people to understand how easily accessible some of these tables of power are. Now, it doesn't mean that when you get there, they're going to welcome you. That's why you don't go alone. Organize your neighborhood, organize your family, and show up. And when you show up, make sure that you have your ideas written out and your demands written out. And that's not just, I'm not just saying that to be saying that. I'm saying it because they're going to try to spin you off, and you want to have something that everybody understands is the goal line, is the finish line for whatever initiative that you're pushing. But you have that power. And never forget that this is not, they're not up here and you're down here. This democracy is set up to have power at the consent of the people being governed. And that's you.
And that's bars. I want to thank Nick Muhammad, Harry Colbert Jr., and Mayor Mike Elliott for this thoughtful conversation. I also want to note that the city manager, Reggie Edwards, was unable to join us because he's traveling. So we want to wish him some safe travels and look forward to having him back on the show. Nick, you made a phenomenal point about anyone can go in and bring something into law. I know our sister Adriene was having some tech issues. She may or may not be closing us out with a COVID update. So until she gets back, I'll share this story. I first got into advocating for public policy in March of 2020. First time was right before the pandemic. I have no background in public policy. My origin to social justice and affecting change was in grassroots community activism and organizing. Still, I was passionate about Black maternal health. I recognized the statistics were there. I had my own personal lived experience of being impacted through a lens of health inequities and injustices and racial bias within the medical system, and I wanted to do something about it. So I showed up to City Hall and didn't even have a contact, and said, you know what, I'm just going to walk around with my baby until someone asks me why I'm here, and then they can point me in the direction of where I want to go. Eventually, I was connected with Representative Ruth Richardson, who I knew was also passionate about Black maternal health. And I said, hey, I don't have any experience, but I'm passionate about this, and I want to be a part of it. She had Bill HF 660, which is the Dignity in Pregnancy and Childbirth Act, and she asked me to come and testify. I gave my story. It was completely embarrassing. My baby is walking around, City Hall with one shoe on. She stole a stranger's cell phone. I didn't have childcare. I felt like the least qualified person in the room, but I still showed up and told my story because I knew I was the author of my own experience and therefore an expert, because nobody can tell me about what it's like to be a Black mother but me. And so to any young person who's watching or community member who feels like, oh, well, I don't have this background, therefore, I can't be in this space. You just showing up in your experience and sharing about what that is like is incredibly effective to policymakers and legislators who don't know what that experience is like. And just by me doing that, in the continual advocacy of Rachel Hardiman, whose research is world renowned, from Representative Ruth Richardson committing herself to advocating for Black moms, and me showing up at the table every time that there was a session and a hearing on Black maternal health, Bill HF 660 is now law. It was just signed by the governor last week. I don't have any experience in that, but that is just an example of you just stepping into your own power and saying, we're not going to accept this experience anymore. It is possible for you to affect change. That being said, I see our sister Adriene is back. Fellas, I want to thank you so much for your contributions to this conversation. We're going to close out this conversation by addressing health equity in a different way, talking about COVID. So Adriene, you and I spoke earlier this week. You said, you know what? I have to be honest with you, Britt, the numbers still do not look good for Black people. We are still being disproportionately impacted and getting incredibly sick. So please tell us how and why this is going on, especially now that there's a vaccine.
Right. So everyone is familiar with the Minnesota Department of Health numbers and the reports that everything is going down. The number of new COVID cases is going down, the number of hospitalizations, and the number of deaths. And that's all well and good. It's great. However, the cases that we are seeing are still majority Black and brown people. So if we have, say, 382 new cases of COVID, which was reported this morning, about 300 of those are in Black and brown people. We still make up most of the hospitalizations. We continue to make up most of the critical illness related to COVID-19, as well as the deaths. And this is because the majority of the new cases are not vaccinated. We know that our vaccine is safe, it's effective. They all provide protection against the new variants that are circulating in the United States. But if you are not vaccinated, which many of our children are not, many of our children are under 12 years old and aren't eligible to get vaccinated. So when people ask me, why did you get vaccinated? I got vaccinated to protect my son, who is 27 years old, but is a special needs person and has a fragile immune system. We all need to get vaccinated to protect our children, because now we're seeing an increase in the number of children who have COVID and the number of children who are getting critically ill and possibly dying from COVID. And it's mostly in our kids and our Black and brown kids because they're not vaccinated. So even though the numbers are looking better overall, it still looks really bad for our community. So we have to do our part and go out and get vaccinated. If you're still concerned or worried about the vaccine, we understand that. That is totally normal. That's appropriate. Ask the questions that you need to ask so that you are comfortable to get the vaccine. I'm available. Dr. Zeke is always available. You can find us on social media. People have reached out to me via Facebook and Instagram, and I've answered their questions. So we're here and we're available, but rather than walking around wondering and questioning and not agreeing with what you're hearing, ask those important questions so that you can get vaccinated and protect our community.
Absolutely. And of course, let's not forget mask wearing and using proper hand hygiene still does work. We are not post-COVID, although the restrictions have lifted and it kind of feels that way, right? We are still in the middle of a global pandemic and our communities are disproportionately impacted. So please do what you can to protect yourself and protect your loved ones. And ultimately, it's us that's going to be the greatest remedy. If you do have questions or hesitancy about the vaccine, which my family did, I reached out to Adriene. My mom is now vaccinated and so is my little brother. So truly ask. There's no dumb question or silly question or apprehension. And I'm, of course, vaccinated, although I expressed lots of hesitancy and discomfort at one point. So I want to wrap up this conversation. You probably have noticed by now we extended today's episode because this was such an important conversation to dive deep into. Thank you, panelists, for your flexibility and commitment to holding space for this dialogue. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. We're actually going to be talking to another one of our Black elected officials from the community, Mayor Melvin Carter. So stay tuned for that. And until next time, be good to yourself and be good to those in your community. And if you feel like they have perpetuated harm against you, I promise we have solutions and tools in place for us to lovingly hold one another accountable. So until next time, take care, y'all.